It was October 18, 2011, and the desert seemed to scream silence as an Israeli convoy advanced across the hot sand toward the Egyptian border. Inside one of the armored vehicles, a skinny, pale young man took a deep breath, feeling the wind on his face through the half-open window for the first time in 5 years. Gilad Shalit could hardly believe it was real. After 1,941 days locked in underground tunnels, unable to see the sun, unable to hear his mother's voice, he was finally free. Across the border in Gaza, the scene was euphoric. Fireworks streaked the sky. Green Hamas flags fluttered on every corner, and crowds celebrated in the streets the return of more than 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. What no one knew at the time was that this hostage exchange was planting the seeds of what would come in 2025, when Israel and Hamas would return to negotiating Israeli hostages in Gaza, and when the world would discover that Israel was preparing something in the shadows, something that would completely change the rules of the game in the Middle East. But why on earth was this soldier worth so much? Why would Israel, a world-renowned military power, agree to pay such a high price for a single man? The answer lies not just in military strategy or politics. It lies in the essence of what it means to be Israeli. In the promise the country makes to every citizen who dons the uniform: we will get you, no matter where you are. This agreement, which became known as the largest hostage exchange in history, set a dangerous and at the same time moving precedent, showing the lengths a nation is willing to go for its own. And if you find this story impressive, help me out here. The goal is to get 100 likes on this video. So if you enjoy real stories from the Middle East, Mossad operations, and everything involving Israel and the conflict in Gaza, click that like button now to strengthen the channel. The 2011 Israel-Hamas peace deal wasn't just a rescue. It was a watershed moment that would shape decades of war and diplomacy. And the echoes of that decision still reverberate today as the world again watches the hostage exchange in 2025. To understand what happened on that historic October day and why Israel accepted this insane bargain, you need to go back 5 years and learn about this kidnapped Israeli soldier who would become the symbol of a negotiation that would divide opinion worldwide. Gilad Shalit's story begins long before the desert, long before the tunnels, long before the cameras. It begins with an ordinary 19-year-old boy who woke up one day without imagining he would become the most famous hostage in the Middle East. And that's precisely why this story is so important, because it's not just about war and diplomacy, but about how a single human being can become a chess piece in a game that lasts decades. So take a deep breath, because this journey will take you behind the scenes of the secret negotiations between Israel and Hamas, through the failed Mossad rescue operations, through the human drama of a family that refused to give up, and through the cold geopolitical reality that transformed the Gilad Shalit rescue into a landmark that still influences every new Israel-Hamas agreement to this day. Who was Gilad Shalit? Gilad Shalit was no super soldier, no elite commander, no war hero with medals on his chest. He was just a 19-year-old boy born in Nahariya, a coastal city in northern Israel, to Noam and Aviva Shalit, an ordinary family who lived a quiet life away from the spotlight. He grew up like any young Israeli. He went to school, played soccer with his friends, dreamed of the future, and when the time came, like every Israeli citizen, he donned the olive green uniform to complete his mandatory military service. There was nothing extraordinary about Gilad, and perhaps that's precisely why his story touched the hearts of millions so deeply, because he could have been anyone, anyone's son, any family's brother. And it was this normality that made the case all the more shocking when, in June 2006, everything changed brutally and irreversibly. It was June 25, 2006. And Gilad was on routine patrol near the border with the Gaza Strip in an area known as Kerem Shalom. The scorching Israeli summer sun was beating down, and there was no indication that this would be a different day than any other until suddenly Hamas militants and allied groups launched a coordinated attack on the Merkava tank where Gilad and his team were stationed. The operation was swift, violent, and surgical. 2 Israeli soldiers died in the clash, while Gilad was dragged into a tunnel that led directly to Gaza. Within minutes, the young soldier disappeared from the map, swallowed up by the underground labyrinth that Hamas had built over the years. Israel-Hamas had just entered a new chapter, and the name Gilad Shalit would become synonymous with one of the greatest diplomatic and humanitarian crises in the history of the Middle East. From that moment on, Gilad became a ghost. No photos, no videos, no voices, just the deafening silence of someone unsure whether he was alive or dead. Hamas held the kidnapped Israeli soldier in absolute captivity, using him as a bargaining chip in a negotiation that would last 5 long years. For his family, it was as if the world had stopped. Noam Shalit, his father, left everything to dedicate himself to the campaign for his son's release, while Aviva, his mother, lived in a silent hell of uncertainty. Gilad's face began appearing on posters throughout Israel, on t-shirts, at protests, on every street corner, and the entire country wondered, was he still alive? And if so, in what condition? But to understand the full extent of what would come next, you need to delve into the nightmare that was Gilad Shalit's underground captivity in Gaza. The captivity for 1,941 days, that's right, almost 5.5 years. Gilad Shalit lived in a nightmare most of us can't even imagine. He was kept isolated, constantly moved between safe houses and underground tunnels in Gaza, always in the dark, always alone, always unsure if he would ever see the sun again. The underground Gaza captivity was a complex network of passages dug meters below the surface, far from the eyes of satellites, drones, and Israeli intelligence. Gilad had no contact with the outside world, no letters from his family, no news. He lived in a bubble of absolute solitude, where time seemed to stand still, and each day dragged on like an eternity. Hamas knew exactly what it was doing, keeping the soldier alive but invisible, transforming him into a bargaining chip too valuable to waste and too powerful to ignore. Meanwhile, on the other side of the wall, Israel moved heaven and earth to find him. The Israeli Defense Forces, the Shin Bet, and the feared Mossad, the Israeli secret service known for its covert operations around the world, tracked every clue, every suspicious movement, every rumor that emerged on the streets of Gaza. Israeli intelligence intercepted radios, placed informants on the ground, monitored every Hamas leader, every move of Ahmed Jabari, who at the time was the group's military commander. But Gaza is a dense, chaotic, and hostile urban labyrinth, where every alley could be a trap and every house could hide a secret tunnel. And Gilad in this labyrinth was a ghost, a shadow that Israel pursued but never managed to reach. The soldier was used as political currency, kept alive precisely because dead he was worthless. But alive he represented negotiating power, psychological pressure, and an open wound in Israel's heart. Gilad's psychological torture lay not only in physical isolation, but in constant uncertainty. He didn't know if his family was okay, if Israel was still fighting for him, if he would ever leave or die forgotten in a dark hole in Gaza. This is the cruelest weapon of kidnapping. It's not the physical pain, but the pain of waiting, the pain of not knowing, the pain of feeling that the world has moved on and left you behind. And while Gilad languished in captivity, Israel desperately tried to find a way to get him out, and that was when the most audacious and risky rescue operations in the recent history of the Israel-Palestine conflict began. Operations that almost succeeded, but which ultimately revealed a harsh truth. Rescuing Gilad by force could mean his death sentence. The rescue attempts in the first years after the kidnapping, Israel didn't sit idly by, waiting for a diplomatic solution to fall from the sky. The country activated its most powerful arsenal, the Israeli Defense Forces, the Shin Bet, and the legendary Mossad, the intelligence agency that has carried out some of the most daring and impossible operations in modern history. The mission was clear: locate Gilad Shalit and get him out of Gaza alive, even if it meant turning over every stone in that territory. State-of-the-art drones flew over Gaza day and night, capturing every suspicious movement. Palestinian informants were recruited and infiltrated into Hamas networks. Radio and telephone intercepts were analyzed line by line for any clue. The Mossad, known for its logic-defying secret, Israeli missions, such as the capture of Adolf Eichmann in Argentina in 1960, or the destruction of the Syrian nuclear reactor in 2007, was determined to add the Gilad Shalit rescue to its list of impossible feats. But Gaza wasn't Argentina. and Hamas wasn't an unprotected target. One of the closest Israeli operations to success came when an elite special forces unit tracked a signal indicating Gilad's possible location to a house in a densely populated neighborhood. The rescue operation was mounted with surgical precision, trained commandos, cutting-edge equipment, and mapped escape routes. The team arrived less than 500 meters from the location where, according to intelligence, Gilad was being held, but at the last second the operation was aborted. Why? Because the risk was too high. At the slightest sign of an intrusion, Hamas would immediately execute the hostage, and Israel would lose not only the soldier but also any chance of future negotiations. It was a moment of brutal choice. Risk everything in a bold move or retreat and keep Gilad alive, even if it meant more months or years of captivity. The failed rescue attempts revealed a painful truth that the Israeli government had to swallow. A direct rescue, no matter how well planned, would almost certainly mean the hostage's death. Hamas held Gilad as its trump card and knew it. Any approach by Israeli troops would result in immediate execution. It was then that Israel realized that the only real way out would not come through brute force, but through diplomacy, however bitter the medicine. And while Mossad's covert operations were being shelved one by one, on the other side of the equation, something was happening that would completely change the game. Public pressure within Israel was growing overwhelmingly, transforming the Gilad Shalit case into not just a military issue, but an emotional and political one, capable of toppling governments and forcing decisions that seemed impossible. The first exchange in 2009, after 3 years of stalemate, suffocating silence, and an anguish that gnawed at Israel from within, a first sign of hope finally appeared on the horizon. It was October 2, 2009, and the world was watching something that seemed small but was actually gigantic. Israel agreed to release 20 Palestinian prisoners in exchange for a single video proof of Gilad Shalit's life. It may seem small, exchanging 20 people for just one video, but at that moment, it was worth more than gold. Because after 3 years of knowing absolutely nothing about the soldier, Israel and the Shalit family were desperate for any sign that he was still breathing. The Israel hostages 2025 negotiation we see today has deep roots in this 2009 gesture, which showed Hamas how much Israel was willing to pay and how effective kidnapping was as a political strategy. The video footage was devastating. Gilad appeared thin, pale, with dark circles under his eyes and the empty gaze of someone who had spent years without seeing the light of day. He held a dated newspaper proving he was alive at that very moment, but his appearance screamed the suffering of captivity. He was a 23-year-old who seemed to have aged a decade. That video was broadcast on Israeli television and shocked the entire country. Seeing Gilad like that, exhausted but breathing, rekindled the flame of hope, and at the same time revealed the urgency of the situation. Noam Shalit, his father, upon seeing the images of his son, knew he could wait no longer. Negotiations needed to be accelerated. Gilad needed to be brought home before it was too late. And it was that video, that small gesture in 2009, that unlocked the stalled talks and paved the way for the historic agreement that would come 2 years later. It was a small but crucial gesture, the proof Israel needed to justify internally what would come next. A negotiation that would shock the world and divide opinion within the country. The proof-of-life video not only proved Gilad was alive, but also increased pressure on the Netanyahu government, which now had concrete images of the soldiers suffering and a population demanding results. The 2009 mini-exchange was the first step in a long diplomatic journey, and it demonstrated that in the chess game between Israel and Hamas, each piece had immense value and Hamas knew exactly how to use this to its advantage. But the video also did something unexpected. It transformed Gilad Shalit from a name on posters to a real face, a human being who needed to return home, and this triggered public pressure, the likes of which Israel had never seen before. Public pressure. Noam and Aviva Shalit, Gilad's parents, did something few would have the courage to do. They turned their personal despair into a relentless public campaign that shook Israel from north to south. In March 2010, they set up a protest tent in front of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's official residence in Jerusalem and simply refused to leave. For more than 400 days, yes, more than a full year, Noam and Aviva camped there, sleeping on the ground, braving the winter cold and the scorching summer heat, receiving visitors, giving interviews, crying in public, shouting when necessary. The message was clear and direct. Our son is alive. Bring Gilad home. No matter the cost. That tent became a powerful symbol, a constant reminder that while the government debated strategy and weighed political costs, a young Israeli languished in a dark hole in Gaza. Gilad Shalit's face was literally on every street corner in Israel. Posters with his photo were plastered on lampposts. Giant murals appeared on buildings. T-shirts with the hashtag #FreeGILA were sold across the country, and social media campaigns, still in their infancy at the time, quickly gained traction. Celebrities, opposition politicians, rabbis, artists, students, retirees, all embraced Gilad's cause as their own. Israeli society demanded a steep political price from the Netanyahu government. Do whatever it takes, but bring our soldier back. This public pressure wasn't just emotional, it was strategic. With every protest, every vigil, every time Noam Shalit appeared on TV with tears in his eyes, the government felt the weight of millions of Israelis saying the same thing. We cannot abandon one of our own. And herein lies the powerful lesson of this story. Public opinion can move mountains. It can force governments to make decisions they would never make based solely on strategic calculations. Israel is a small country where everyone knows someone who served in the army, where every family has a son, a brother, a cousin who wore the uniform. Gilad wasn't just a soldier, he was the symbol of all soldiers, and the implicit message was clear. If we don't rescue Gilad, who can guarantee they'll rescue me if I'm captured? This emotional and social pressure created an environment where the Netanyahu government had no choice. Either bring Gilad back or pay an unsustainable political price. And it was precisely this storm of emotions and demands that opened the door to what would come next. A secret, complex, and controversial negotiation that would involve Egypt and Germany, and forever changed the dynamic between Israel and Hamas. The negotiation, with the crucial support of Egypt and Germany, who acted as neutral mediators, secret negotiations finally began behind the scenes of international diplomacy. On one side of the table, or rather, on one side of the encrypted telephone and secret rooms, was the Netanyahu government, closely advised by the Mossad and the Shin Bet, two of the world's most feared intelligence services. On the other side were representatives of Hamas, led by Ahmed Jabari, the group's military commander who years later would be eliminated by Israel in a 2012 air raid. The secret Hamas-Israel negotiations were tense, slow, and fraught with obstacles. Each side tried to extract the maximum from the other. Every concession was forced out, and every word was weighed down by the weight of decades of conflict in the Middle East. Egypt, under Hosni Mubarak and men during the political transition, served as a bridge between two enemies who refused to sit in the same room. Israel drew a red line in the negotiations from the outset. It categorically refused to release prisoners with blood-stained hands, that is, terrorists convicted of murdering Israeli civilians, responsible for suicide bombings, bus bombings, and market attacks. For the Israeli government, releasing these people would be like spitting on the graves of the victims and giving carte blanche for further attacks in the future. But Hamas knew exactly what it was doing. The more Israel resisted, the more domestic public pressure would grow, and eventually Netanyahu would have to give in. And that's exactly what happened. Pressured by Gilad's parents' campaign, street protests, media demands, and a public opinion that could no longer bear to wait, the Prime Minister made one of the most controversial decisions of his career. He gave in. The final agreement was announced and shocked the world. Israel would release 1,027 Palestinian prisoners, including those convicted of very serious crimes, in exchange for a single soldier, Gilad Shalit. When details of the deal leaked, Israel erupted in heated debate. Families of terrorist attack victims protested in the streets, shouting that the government was betraying the memory of their loved ones by releasing the killers. Security analysts warned that this exchange would set a dangerous precedent. If the kidnapping of one Israeli soldier was worth 1,000 prisoners, Hamas would surely try to repeat the same formula in the future, And guess what? They were absolutely right. The 2011 Israel-Hamas hostage swap planted the seed for what we see happening in 2025, where once again Israeli hostages in Gaza are being traded for Palestinian prisoners. But despite all the criticism and all the risks, the deal was struck. Israel chose heart over head, chose to bring a son home, even if it meant releasing future enemies. And on October 18, 2011, the largest hostage exchange in history was about to take place. The exchange on the morning of October 18, 2011, the world stopped to witness something historic. The operation began at dawn, with meticulous coordination involving Israel, Hamas, Egypt, and Germany, every step planned down to the smallest detail, because any mistake could cause everything to collapse. Gilad Shalit was taken to the Rafah border crossing, on the Gaza-Egypt border, where Egyptian mediators first received him, checked his health, and confirmed his identity. Only then was he handed over to the Israeli authorities waiting on the other side. Meanwhile, on the Israeli side, 477 Palestinian prisoners were released in the first phase of the agreement, yes, because there were so many that the release had to be split into 2 stages. The tension was palpable. Cameras around the world broadcast every second live, and millions of people held their breath waiting to see if Gilad would actually cross that border alive. Among the 477 released in the first phase was a name few paid attention to at the time, but which would become absolutely crucial to understanding the Israel-Palestine conflict in the following years. Yahya Sinwar. This man, sentenced to 4 life sentences for planning and executing the kidnapping and murder of 2 Israeli soldiers in the 1980s, was released from Israeli prisons in 2011 as part of the Gilad Shalit agreement. Yahya Sinwar was no ordinary prisoner. He was one of Hamas's most radical leaders, a man who dedicated his entire life to the armed struggle against Israel. And in 2025, this same Yahya Sinwar would become Hamas's top leader in Gaza and the mastermind behind the October 7, 2023 attack, which resulted in the capture of new Israeli hostages and restarted the cycle we are witnessing today. Israel unwittingly freed the architect of future tragedies, and this is something that echoes to this day in negotiations between Israel and Hamas. Upon crossing the border, Gilad could barely walk on his own. His body was weakened, his legs weak, and 5 years of underground captivity in Gaza had taken a brutal toll. But he was alive, and that was all that mattered in that moment. Israel erupted in emotion. People wept in the streets, horns honked, Israeli flags fluttered from every building. Noam and Aviva Shalit finally embraced their son after 1,941 days of agony, and that embrace, broadcast live to millions, symbolized something greater than just a family reunion. It symbolized Israel's promise to never abandon its own. On the other side in Gaza, the scene was different. Crowds celebrated the return of Palestinian prisoners as heroes. Hamas used the exchange as powerful political propaganda, and Ahmed Jabari, the group's military commander, gave interviews declaring it a great victory. 2 peoples, 2 narratives, an exchange that would change everything. The reactions in Israel, the reaction was deeply divided, like everything in a country accustomed to heated debates and strong opinions. Part of the population celebrated in the streets as if it were New Year's Eve. Entire families left their homes just to feel the energy of the moment, to hug strangers, to share the feeling that finally, a story with a happy ending had happened amidst so much suffering. Gilad was home, alive, and that was enough. But on the other side, another significant portion of Israeli society protested in outrage. They freed murderers for a single soldier? Shouted families of victims of terrorist attacks. They saw the faces of the 1,027 prisoners being released and recognized some of them. The man who blew up a bus in Jerusalem, the one who planned the suicide attack in a supermarket, the one who killed children in a pizzeria. For these families, the 2011 Israel-Hamas agreement was not a victory. It was a betrayal, a message that the blood of their loved ones was worth less than the life of a soldier. In the Palestinian territories, especially in Gaza, the reaction was one of total euphoria. Hamas was welcomed as an absolute hero, the group that managed to subdue Israel, that managed to wrest more than 1,000 prisoners from the enemy's hands, that proved that resilience and patience can overcome even the most powerful military machine in the Middle East. Ahmed Jabari, Hamas's military commander at the time, gave interviews celebrating the exchange as a monumental strategic victory. The movement gained immeasurable political strength. On the streets of Gaza, Hamas came to be seen as the only group capable of facing Israel on equal terms. And figures freed in that agreement like Yahya Sinwar, released in 2011, returned to their communities as living legends, as men who survived Israeli prisons and emerged stronger, more determined, more dangerous. The impact of the 2011 exchange on the current conflict is impossible to ignore. Those prisoners did not return home to live in peace. Many returned to the battlefield. The international community also reacted, each country through its own lens. The United States publicly supported Israel, asserting that every country has the right to bring its citizens home. But behind the scenes, American analysts warned of the dangerous precedent being set. Europe, through Germany, which helped broker the deal, saw the exchange as a necessary step to ease tensions, while acknowledging the risks. Arab countries celebrated quietly, seeing the prisoner release as a symbolic victory against Israel. And human rights organizations were divided. Some praised the release of Palestinian prisoners who had spent years or decades in prison, while others questioned whether releasing those convicted of terrorism would put more lives at risk in the future. In the end, the largest hostage exchange in history was not just a logistical operation, it was a mirror that reflected the moral, political, and human complexities of a conflict that has no right or wrong side, only pain on all sides. The consequences Israel learned the hard way that each hostage is much more than a person. They are a strategic weapon, a psychological pressure point, capable of bending even the most steadfast government. The exchange of Gilad Shalit showed the entire world that Israel has a weak spot, its visceral attachment to each citizen, its cultural refusal to leave anyone behind, its sacred promise that we will get him. And this, however noble, became a vulnerability exploited by groups like Hamas. After 2011, Israeli security strategists had to completely rethink their doctrines, how to protect soldiers in high-risk zones, how to prevent kidnappings from becoming a recurring tactic, how to balance the heart, which screams "bring our son back," with the cold reason that warns, this will cost lives in the future. But the problem is that in a democracy where public opinion weighs heavily, the heart almost always wins. On the other side, Hamas learned an even more dangerous lesson. Kidnapping works, and it works very well. Starting in 2011, capturing Israeli soldiers or civilians officially became part of the group's strategic doctrine. Why? Because a single Israeli hostage is worth more at the negotiating table than 100 fighters on the battlefield. A hostage paralyzes Israel emotionally, puts political pressure on the government, and can result in the release of hundreds or even thousands of Palestinian prisoners. It's cruel, but effective mathematics. And Hamas wasn't alone in this learning. Other groups in the region watched closely and thought, if it worked once, it can work again. Real history in the middle. East teaches us that precedent matters, and the 2011 precedent was clear. Kidnapping Israelis works. And one of those released in 2011, Yahya Sinwar, the man who walked out of Israeli prisons after serving a 22-year sentence, would be the mastermind behind the October 7, 2023 offensive, the Hamas attack that shocked the world and resulted in the capture of more than 200 Israeli hostages. Sinwar didn't forget the lesson. He saw, with his own eyes, the power a hostage has over Israel. And when he assumed leadership of Hamas in Gaza, he applied exactly the same strategy on a much larger scale. Today, in 2025, the world is once again watching negotiations between Israel and Hamas involving Gaza hostages, and it's impossible not to see the ghost of 2011 hovering over every conversation, every proposal, every exchange. The cycle repeats itself because the method works, and as long as it works, it will continue to be used. The Gilad Shalit exchange wasn't just a ransom. It was the opening of a Pandora's box that no one has been able to close. The reflection in 2025 today, in 2025, the world is witnessing a new negotiation between Israel and Hamas, and it's as if we're watching the same movie play out again, only this time with a much larger cast and even more devastating consequences. More than a decade after the historic exchange of Gilad Shalit, the same strategy is repeated. Israeli hostages in Gaza being used as bargaining chips for Palestinian prisoners. Desperate families pressuring the government, international mediators trying to broker an impossible deal. The difference is that this time we're not talking about a single soldier, but dozens of civilians and military personnel captured in the attack of October 7, 2023, one of the bloodiest days in Israel's history. And leading this operation, Yahya Sinwar, 2025, the same man Israel released in 2011, thinking he was simply bringing Gilad home, never imagining he was releasing the architect of a future tragedy. And it's impossible to understand the present without looking back to 2011. The Gilad Shalit exchange set the precedent, showed the lengths Israel is willing to go to bring its citizens back, and taught Hamas the devastating psychological power of a hostage. To know what happened in that deal is to understand why history is repeating itself now. Yahya Sinwar, who spent 22 years in Israeli prisons, studying his captors, learning fluent Hebrew, and understanding the Israeli mentality, knew exactly what he was doing when he planned the 2023 attack. He applied the same formula that worked with Gilad Shalit, but on an industrial scale: capture as many Israelis as possible and use them as leverage to extract political, military, and diplomatic concessions from Israel. The Israel 2025 war we see in the headlines today has deep roots in the 2011 deal. It's a direct line, connecting past and present. The 2025 negotiations are eerily similar to those of 2011. Egypt and other countries trying to mediate, Israel divided internally between families shouting, "Bring our children back at any cost," and voices warning, "We cannot repeat the mistake of 2011." Hamas demanding the release of thousands of Palestinian prisoners, including those convicted of serious crimes. The history of hostage exchanges from Gilad Shalit to 2025 reveals a clear pattern. As long as Israel values each individual life above strategic calculations, and this is both its greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability, groups like Hamas will continue to use hostages as a weapon. And the big question no one can answer is how to break this cycle. How can Israel protect its citizens without creating incentives for more kidnappings? The answer, if it even exists, is still being written in the secret negotiation rooms taking place right now. The return and reflection: Gilad Shalit returned to civilian life, but not in the way everyone expected, because no one emerges intact from 1,941 days in underground captivity. He tried to rebuild his life, worked as a journalist for a while, gave a few interviews, and appeared at public events, but always with that distant look of someone who has seen things he can't or won't put into words. In rare interviews years later, Gilad admitted with brutal honesty, "I spent years without seeing the sun. I lived in the dark, not knowing if I was alive or dead. I was never the same again." And this sentence sums up the human price that no one accounts for in diplomatic agreements. You can bring back the body, but the mind, the spirit, that 19-year-old boy who went out to patrol the border one random morning in 2006 that never comes back. Gilad Shalit 2025 is a transformed, scarred man who carries on his shoulders the weight of having been the most expensive bargaining chip in the history of the Israel-Hamas conflict. Ultimately, the 2011 exchange was a human victory, but a strategic dilemma that Israel is still trying to come to terms with. Israel saved a son. It fulfilled its sacred promise to abandon no one, that every citizen matters, that there is no acceptable number of dead or forgotten. And that is beautiful. It is inspiring. It is the kind of courage that makes a country strong, even if small. But at the same time, Israel freed more than 1,000 prisoners, including Hamas leaders who would return to the battlefield, who would plan new attacks, who would teach the next generation of fighters. Among them, Yahya Sinwar, and we know what he did next. It was a decision that saved one life but cost others, and continues to do so to this day. The price of a soldier, 1,000 to 1, this impossible equation that Israel had to solve, shows the moral complexity of war and diplomacy in the Middle East. There are no perfect decisions, only choices between tragedies. A decision that still echoes in every hostage, every negotiation, and every new exchange the world witnesses today. The Gilad Shalit case is not just a story of the past, It is a lens through which we understand the present. When you watch the news about hostages and politics in the Middle East in 2025, when you watch negotiations between Israel and the new Israel-Hamas Accord, you are seeing the direct legacy of that October morning in 2011. The true story of courage and negotiation, the human drama of war. Israel's secret missions, all of this forms a complex mosaic where heroes and villains are not easily identifiable, where every victory carries an embedded defeat, and where every choice has consequences that reverberate for decades. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all this is, in conflicts like this, there are no complete happy endings, only chapters that close while others open, in a cycle that seems to have no end. Conclusion. And now, after learning this whole story, from Gilad Shalit's kidnapping in 2006 to the negotiations still ongoing in 2025, the question remains, what will you do with this knowledge? Because it's not enough to just watch, it's not enough to just know what happened. You need to understand the layers behind the conflicts you see in the news. You need to question the simplistic narratives that try to transform complex wars into stories of good guys and bad guys. What does Gilad Shalit's exchange teach us about values? About the price of human life? About the consequences of our choices? Was Israel wrong to release 1,000 prisoners for one soldier, or did it do exactly what any nation should do for its own? These are questions that don't have easy answers, but they are questions you need to ask yourself. Think about it. How many times have you seen headlines about the Israel-Palestine conflict and simply ignored them because they seem too complicated, too distant from your reality? Gilad Shalit's story shows that behind every number, every statistic, every negotiation, there are real human beings, parents who camp for 400 days asking for their son back. Soldiers who spend years in the dark without knowing if they will ever see the sun again. Leaders who must choose between saving one and risking hundreds. Can you imagine the anguish of making such a decision? Can you put yourself in the shoes of Noam and Aviva Shalit, who fought tirelessly while the world kept turning? And most importantly, what does this story teach you about perseverance, about not giving up even when all seems lost? Now, I want to challenge you. Are you really paying attention to the world around you? Or are you just consuming superficial information without understanding the context? Because understanding the history behind the hostage exchanges from Gilad Shalit to 2025 makes you more aware, more critical, better prepared to interpret the chaos that is global geopolitics. And if you've made it this far, if you've followed this journey from beginning to end, then you're exactly the kind of person this channel needs. So subscribe now, turn on the notification bell, because there's much more real history, plenty of secret Mossad operations, plenty of conflict in Gaza, and plenty of in-depth content about Israel, Hamas, and the Middle East coming your way. Don't miss out. The knowledge that sets you apart from the masses is here, and I'll keep bringing it to you.